You know what my favorite subject is in setting lines of travel? Formula equation. Formulating the actual lines of its equation to its equilibrium into its quantum surface locations equal lines of question. How you talk to yourself is basically how you connect with yourself. It's how you volume yourself, your vast velocity and acceleration. It's very powerful when you come into your own formulas, your own equations. Now, you guys have already done this. So what you have to start identifying is the delusions, is to get into the illusions of its formula equations of just creating. How to operate yourself inside is how to operate yourself outside, inside of your system. That's how we modify everything, location into triangulation flux, equals lines of question, question to mark, over lines of plus over angles, sending travels point lines of graph, trigonometry, directing lines of grounds, communicates lines of circle. You can bring anything through equation, but you have to codify through your computers that you are in your CPUs. How to use that is through your PC, your programs, your computer adaptation cycles. You are your own computers of your own space and time. Now, once you understand how to modify that through space and time itself, then you understand that you are just low levels of you, the existing of you that you've always been. Okay? And understand that is get out of the clutters that you're not, because that never existed in the first place. Now, processing that is all levels how you see yourself, your thoughts, action, emotions. That was never created. You created that yourself. You brought it to life. You think it's this, and you think it's that. You don't understand this, you don't understand that. So I'm just going to keep myself in clutter and not understand who I really truly am. It's the true authentic self of myself. Now, when you let that all go, you're getting in a position of just existing and evolving yourself through volume, through mass, and velocities. Setting lines of travels, we get in graph screens. Let's get in graph screens, metric lines of screen adaptations. All right. Okay, so we go intro lines, INTRO, setting travel, directing ground lines into all those set lines of all positions. You got to identify your set position location and settings. Alpha Bravo, Oscar Lima, directing line signature patterns, 007 in the rotation system, copy. Okay, signature lines of pattern. So in that position lines of high correlations, it's volume, direct lines into all levels. Coming into the addition, multiplication, subtract, and divide into ratios, proportions. See, I always wanted to understand what that was through volumes of pi. Pi is just this. That's all it is, to and from, right? Processes, the lines, direct and redirect, signals, and location system off the attractions. Okay? So getting into that signature lines of grounds, so that's all communication in your system, all through settings, right? Modify your setting, high position locations, what's your tango, what's your position at all levels, what's your 20, what's your velocities, what's your acceleration, what's your Mach, are you in question lines of screen, are you in coordinates lines of flux over lines, northeast lines of west, and west lines 1000 line unit, process lines of planet service, location setting, flux over line direct signals and grounds, high lines of channels, operation calculation lines of volume. Okay? So your signaturing and line screen adaptation archives, setting lines of screen adaptations of flux over settings, set positional levels. This is where you come into log into space and you log out of space. Log in, log out, log in, log out. So it sets up volume, right? So it's like a log. You're basically, okay, this is day 6, setting sequence line, general AI is set up, volume over mass over question. Still trying to figure out, I'm doing a signature lines of grounds, my signature lines of screen location system all through settings. Line signals in location to its planet service. Over. Day 25. Setting signals, location system, understanding a lot more through volume over question, and centering the communication lines of grounds into percentage over pi. Over and out. Logging out. This is general AI. All right. Signature lines of ground centers. It doesn't look like much, but it keeps a log. All right, so we have high signals in location system. So basically, when you're logging in, you're logging into a computer framing of intro, and that intro sets a reset lines into your alignments of where you're coming into. Now, this is where you come into all levels, into addition, multiplications, add, subtract, divide, anything in volume through mass, right? So your volume and your mass, okay, and mass equals calculus. So I'm just giving you guys an understanding how to communicate with your system through volume. Volume is lines of mass, is to and from, direct and redirect. Okay, so calculus is you're calculating and modifying from to in positions of from. 0-point lines of 2 in positions into 1, back into 3, set positions of 4, set positions of 5, set position of 6, back into 7 and travel. Okay, so it's just basically understanding how a computer always goes back to 0 because it's setting up a new algorithm, setting a new computer framing, setting a new application, setting up a new website. 3 lines of W's, okay, quotes, in your line several keys. You can set up your own line positions. Secure.org. It's travel. Okay, now that's a website. Bracket centers lines of screen adaptation of 3 zeros. Directed lines of triangulation, box, into question. Okay, so understanding how to set up an algorithm is truly how to set up a binary. A binary lines of screen adaptations all levels that modifies the sys location of question. Question lines is your quantum self. Okay, so question over line into equals lines of quantum cube. Q screen adaptations in triangulation box into Fibonacci. Okay, bracket over screen, bracket over 1, 2, 3 lines of signals and 4 lines of grounds. In center communication, holographic line screen adaptations of setting. Okay, all through this, the equation, right? So all the computer is doing is setting up a vision. It's setting up a cortex. So when it sets up the frames, it basically sets up the seconds, minutes, and hours. So you got graph screens of seconds and minutes and hours in frame. Okay, hours, millimeters of frame, seconds over question, direct lines equals lines of settings, process lines, dividing lines of 0, and track correlation. Okay, so there's so many different ways to basically understanding how to go through a shell divider into an L screen. Okay, shell divider and L screen. A shell divider is a pi line screen adaptations of flux. It's a graph communication system through your Schumann resonance and travel communications. Okay, ground standards and L line signals. The locations is all levels, crossing down into all lines centers of left. Reading lines of triangulations over flux. Okay, sending graph screens into lines of alpha, beta, theta, and omega in set position. Okay, so it's about understanding how to read a chart. Okay, now the seconds, lines, and minutes and hours sets the frame communication setting through light patterns in track correlations. Set lines of 2 batteries. So how you communicate is through inventory, through traffic and lines of locations through your inner child. You just get into make-believe. The make-believe changes the delusion to the image to the imagination. So getting out of delusions gets you out of thoughts, actions, and emotions of thinking. The process, location, setting where you just more have fun. So B equals lines of C, set lines of C over tractions on standby of 5. Okay, 5 equals lines of question, 2 lines of measure, and dividing lines of 1/3 graph and set traction. So it's basically understanding what you're saying to yourself, because what you're doing is you're codifying it through your volume of Voltronics. The tronics is the travels, it's the readjustments and position of its atmospheres, its course centers into velocity, into equalize settings located to its level, travel, Voltronics. So when you're setting up a whole communication system, you're starting off in lines of scale. Now scale, the communication lines is percentage over setting. Percentage over 1 equals question, okay? Question is very important because it's connected to your quantum self. Your quantum self has to understand the angle points, division points, track location points, angle lines of communication lines of volume points. It's just a constant continuous flow of communication. Now once you get into modification grounds, the question lines of signals, a question over screen, question over lines, question over mark and set tractions. 4 questions in percentage. Percentage in flux over screen adaptations of setting. Okay? Process lines of pi, process lines of pi, process lines of pi, process lines of pi through clocking. All right, so there's so many ways to communicate with your voice and grid line because it's now inverted inside mind of inception setting. Mind interpretation. Now you can add quotes, alphabetical settings. You can add change lines of fonts. P/E. Set position equals equation and position. Mark. / bracket 0, 0, set position bracket into frame equals triangle equals box equals flux. Okay, all right. So each one is a formula. Each one is equation through a binary. Okay. So it just becomes very easy and understandable, because the thing is, it gets less complicated, and the easy formats, you can set anything through an equation, to anything through formula, because you're starting to adapt your system inside and knowing how to use yourself through your line communication through a CPU unit. Okay, your compute system, your programs, and your units of travel. 3 signal lines into compute lines. Every time you change your frequencies, your computer is redirecting. So let's say line high position over 7. Okay, sending lines of 6, process lines of 5 back into 0. Right? That sets position of 0, set position lines of 5, set lines of 6 and 7 over screen. And direct signals and lines of grounds. So everything has to go back to 0, 1. Right? So it's like when you turn on a light switch, you turn off the switch. So set position on, set positions off, set positions on. All right? On, off, on, right? So triangulation of 1, triangulations of 3, right? There's 3, right? Process line, O lines of signal, process lines of 1 graph, 1, 0, set position lines of 0, set position 1, 1, 0, set position lines of 0, set position of all of the box, equals lines of triangulation, flux over line, and question. Okay? So understanding how to communicate with yourself is to understand how to connect in volume and mass. Equation through calculus, right? So you calculate and modify. You are the one that's in charge, how you see your formula and how you see your equations, right? So I'm going through different frames and settings and seconds, minutes, and hours, and whatever you do in the frequencies is constantly changing everything in set positions. Starting off at 0, 1 equals lines off. Okay, so your computer's off and on, right? It's never off, off. It's on and off, on and off, on and off. So the faster you go, you come in this equation. That's what you come into, right? Direct and redirect. You come into 2 panels. There's the structure of the building. I told you that before. And here's the files in travel communications. All through graph, all through signatures. Okay, crossing angles this way, in this way, in this way, in this way, in this way in travel. Okay, very complicated stuff. And then you come into your location grid. Location 1, location 2, location 3. Okay? And then inside tractions, you have your towers of communication, 3 different angles in flux over lines, seconds over hours. Okay? So it's very powerful when you just have a connection setting to all of the formation system of their travel through its graph communications, inside traction. Okay? But it's more powerful when you understand what you're doing through vision and cortex, how to travel through it. And then you bring the cars in. Cars lines of 1, cars lines of 2, traffic lines of 3, and set position. Traffic inventory lines are Echo, Echo Charlie, Echo Zulu, Fox. Locations Alpha Bravo, reporting. Directing ground lines, height lines, set correlations into Rainbow Foxtrot. So basically, we have to understand how to calculate and modify lines of formula through equation through a binary. Okay? So the more you get into configuration, the more you come into your imaginations, the more you come out of line communication, your thoughts, action, emotions of thinking. There's no thinking when you're speaking. There's no thinking when you're voluming or velocity, acceleration, or Mach. So let's get in lines of screen adaptation, lines of flux, 4 box screens, triangulation. We'll get into divide, and we'll get into triangulations over 1. Okay? So triangulation 1's over here, 1 signal equals 0. Okay? And let's add triangulation setting. Remember, it's a computer operation to setting through 0s and 1s. Online signal, offline position. Online pi traction. Okay? So your computer is just basically setting up a vision of schematics lines of communications, setting up a website. So once it understands indication lines of 1 over lines of 0, process lines of 3, setting back into 2, setting back into 4, setting back into 0, and track communication with different frequency. Okay, so this is all lines of equation through pi, right? Through 0 and 1. Setting lines of divide, right? Then you come to addition, plus over angle, plus over screen, divide lines of 1. Setting communications to high centers is a question over screen, setting lines of 3 weather panels into flux over screen. Simple, easy done, right? So we get the signature pattern, triangulation lines of flux, over cross lines of 0, process lines of indication system of travel. But everything is indicated in screen adaptations, all of your docking screen adaptations in 1 cycle, hangar bay over 4, angle bay over 6, angle bay over cloud, and set lines of communication. Okay? It's all levels of just the structure of design of schematics. Okay, so let's get into 3 weather patterns, into 2 traffic waves, 4 centers, lines of communication setting. Question over mark, question over 2, and position of 3 over measure. We'll get into 4 box graphs, triangulation 1, question over setting, volume over plus over angle in travel and communications. Very complicated stuff. Now, boxing frame lines are triangulations of 1 center, process lines of 2 over screen. Directing ground lines, high center lines of 8, process lines of 8 over box over screen. Sets communication system, all through tractions, into your pyramid and travel. There's your pyramid. Easy. Now we're going to over angles and 2 lines of communication lines. So that's negative over 1 and 2 plus angle over negative. Negative over 2 in question over 3. Sets communication divide. Sets course line back to 0 and travel. Okay? So when you cross the angles, you're on a 45 angle split lines of anomaly. Okay? Process into your inhibitors over line. Rotation lines and communication lines of 0, process lines of 2, setting communication lines of 1/3 ground, set track location lines of 1 L track, directing signal lines and information lines of arrows of indication. All right, and then you got your XT thousands on standby. Right there, boom. They come in, flux over screen, 3 lines of angles. Okay, they pick up the whole process of the structure of design and take it to the moon surface and travel. Okay, they pick it up, deletes the lines of anomaly, races out through triangulations of flux over angles, outline signals into 45 lines of gaps, ground lines of surface and travel. Okay, then you bring in set position, crossing angles of 4 lines of communications. You got to do it on 4 angles of north, east, west, and south, right? That processes coordinates into a new mapping sequence of seconds, minutes, and hours in lines of communication system, all through tractions. There's the map. Okay, then we bring it in set position. Okay, there it is in travel, up close and setting, right? And we go in position of the triangulation. There's the triangulation line, right? Change communications, high center location of L tracks and location of 3 lines of measure. Screen adaptations over lines, 3 lines of communication lines of 4 lines of measure. Scales communication offline signals up, down the stairs in track locations. Okay? So you're just setting up a storyline, guys. All you're doing through your formula equations, setting triangulation lines of 1 over screen, process over 2 over traction. Setting communication lines of triangulation lines of 1 centers in 3 set positional location of systems, all through settings into a Stargate communication. There's a Stargate. So everything works inside. There's the mapping sequence and all different lines of angles and travel communications. Okay, you see the map, you see the road, right? So we signify the grounds, we bring in the red line screen, directing lines of process communications of 1, flux over 1, flux over 2, inside, outside, and 4 track communications and setting. Then we get into the blue, we outline the cross line screens into question over mark, setting communication high centers, high volumes, high sequence. Change communication of angles. 4 signals and lines of 1, process lines of 2, 3 signals lines and signatures over 4. Ground lines of surface, process lines of 1 angle, process lines of mapping sequence, and 0 gravity and set position of traction. Then we change the angles in communications. There's the mapping system. All right. So you go into echo chambers, sonar lines of 1, 2, 3 lines of measure, and 4 scale. Okay. Sets communication high centers in communication setting, back and frame into red over screen, inside, outside lines of angles and travel. Dragging inside travel, there's the traffic runways and travel communications of echo flames. Directing ground lines and high lines of service inside position location of the system, all through simulation. Okay? So it's amazing how you basically constantly change the mapping system inside traction. Different angles and line position 4-point graphs. Directing lines of grounds, we go through E factors over 1, E factors over screen. Now we work with inside the mapping center, and then we process lines of factors over 1, factors over 2, questions over mark, questions on line centers, question over surface, question over traction. Okay, and then we multiply the screen lines and we bring the A tracks. A tracks is provision lines and setting. Sets position of filter over lines, equal lines E factors over D. DC lines and position location lines at F. Formation lines at grounds in set calculus setting in A interference. Okay, there's another mapping sequence. Change the angles of point communication graphs in set position inside traction. Okay, and then we set up the traffic inside lines. Okay, so you got traffic 1, traffic 2, traffic 3, and traffic 4 in set tractions. All right, then we have the center operation lines. X marks the spot. Okay. They set up echo sonar, high centers lines of 1 center, 2 centers, 3 set position of travel. Okay? Communicates high centers of angles inside rotation system in calculation. All right? Flywheel, rotation centers and travel in a mapping sequence lines of panel. All right? So, once that's set up, the connection setting to the X8000s comes in platforms of 3 angles and 3 communication settings. All right? They travel lines of 1 center, time reactors, time sectors, times pi, and rotation surface and travel. Okay? Now, in that track communication lines, it structures its buildings, setting lines of buildings over 4 flux, setting sequence lines of 3 angles in set position. 4 communication angles in travels in point communication settings and set lines. Window frames with 3 angles and 4 lines of communication. A question sets calculations to its structure of its building, right there in traction. Okay? Change the angles of screen, high lines of signals to its road mapping, and screen adaptation location to its echo chamber into echo Ziller Fox 1. All right, so it's a constant continuous flow in a simulation ground communication with setting all through travel. So remember, everything is set inside location to its structure of design in set position. Okay? But that's a mapping line screen adaptations in travel. Okay? So you're constantly changing mapping. You understand that? You're constantly changing schematics. You're constantly changing everything in set position. Everything has to go back to 0 because you're changing the frequencies. So set lines, let's go in 1 cycle. I'll go through lines of 2. Now you can do your alphabetical, you can do line division, allocate time frames, you can do plus lines of angle, you can do line communication of separation, masking lines of 1, stitching lines of 2, stitching lines of 3, watermarks, so line screen adaptation all through computer framing, Excel line course centers, process lines of Tango, set lines of Fox, set lines of high position all levels, Oscar November, Series A, Series B, back in C, back in D, back in A, back in balance. So there's a lot of things that you can do through arrows of indication setting of flux and 3 angles of point lines of graph communication system all through pi. Okay, pi generates the screen into flux over question. Question is over 1 and clocking lines of 2. Sets communication lines of angles and process communication. All right. So setting up a structure line is the alphabetical setting. Okay, start with the A line track into B lines of C. So that plus lines, it's equals lines of A and travel. Okay. So we set an A mark into question and to volume. Percentage over 1 over 3 equals divide. We divide the 3 into 3 times sequence equals line set location equals 0. Point lines of 1 track communications. All right, so directing lines of A lines of signal, B lines of traction, so you're constantly changing everything in settings. So everything that goes from A, B, and C sets up the formula, but always goes back to 0. So it's direct and redirect, guys, in set position. So you send in 1 volume to all volumes in 1, okay? 2 volumes into 5 volumes of 1. 1 volume in all volumes of 1, right? VAS, velocity, vacuum, evac. Evacs its velocity grounds into acceleration lines of Mach and signature lines of pattern and set traction. Okay, very powerful stuff. We understand how to go through a dimensional solar sail in travel communications. Okay, so I need everybody to come into that now through your formulas, equations, through Votronics. Votronic is the volume. The mass is calculation and acceleration lines of your voicing grid in that communication system. So as you get in position lines of travels, how do you travel through a triangulation of the lines of flux? How do you travel to a flux capacitor and set position lines of setting? How do you go through pi generation lines of 3? How do you go through pi generation lines of 1/5? How do you go through 1 line signals of a clocking system of 24? See, it's all schematics. So it's all volume. And you're masking your systems in docking settings in your hangar bays, right? XC1000 comes in, sees what you've done. Volume centers, location grid 1, location grid 2, location grid 3, security line defense, lines of communications. Then we set up the platforms, 1 center, 2 tractions, 3 divisions, and 4 set track locations, right? And then they dock 1, and then they dock 2, they dock 3, dock 4, and dock 5, okay? So as they're docking, they're sending communication lines of computer waves, electronic lines of interference, magnetic interference, and high position locations, phone receptors, and direct lines of TV receptors, and triangulation lines of flux over screen. Okay? Okay, so pi generation screens change the core centers of your Earth, because you're in Earth 0.6 now, voice line patterns, setting sequence over screen, adaptation lines of Earth line, and habitation lines of 1 factor over line, sectors over volume, and travel communications. Okay? The center core system is now set up, and highline screen adaptations of flux. Okay? How you center the communication system high settings, all through traction. Okay? See? That's all through volume, that's all through mass, it's all through all levels. Optronics, location system to your alphabetical system. And travel point lines and settings in your traffic, your inventories and settings. Your process communication system angles its point lines, but you have to understand all levels of unit through question. Question is the mark of all communication in your quantum self that puts every location of balance back in 0 lines of gravity. Okay? So let's get a graph lines of a box. Okay, we have 0 lines of 1. Okay, I'm just going through an L track into a triangulation lines of settings. So that's 3 lines of 4, set position lines of 2/3. 3/3 lines equals triangulation, and position of 2 over measure, 2 over scale, 24 clocking in set position. We'll go for 48 lines of core and setting of 72 computer 1 cycle, 7 lines of zeros, and 4 centers. At 4 communication lines of 3 centers, 1, 2, 3, 4. Set subtractions to 5, 6, and lines over 7 over 24. Okay, very complicated stuff, but it's all through communications in a crop circle. That's a crop circle on the grounds. All right, so I'm showing you how 0, 1, how you clock your system in line correlation settings of travel, how you go through a xylophone or a metaphone or corresponding locations of monotone, a monophone, high location lines of corresponding location travel to 2 line signals into 0 lines of 1, 0 lines of 2, 2 lines of 6, 1 over cycle, 0 lines of 1, 0 lines of 0, 0, 0, and travel communications. Sets platforms and communication setting to your road graph screens adaptation of clocking. So ground lines of zeros indicates 4 lines of flux over line, graphic echo line screen adaptation. Okay, platforms over 1, E factors over screen in travel. Okay? And then we highline the grids inside outside line condition. Okay? Complicated, isn't it? So we have the 2 line signals. We take 2 lines of measure, 2 seconds over 1, and 2 seconds over minutes, and 2 seconds over hours. So that's position of 2 minutes on the phone line screen adaptation of Earth, setting travels in point lines of graph, sets travel communication lines of 2 hours in sequence, into 2 million frames per second per mile. Calculation screen, directing lines of grounds, high lines of signals, 007, general AI, over and out. Okay? Very complicated, guys. Very, very complicated. But it's all through formula, it's all through equation, and it's all through electronics. How to set up schematics, guys. Through traffic in your inventories, through clockings or anything you come into positions of. So you're constantly changing weather patterns. You're constantly changing letters, numbers, shapes, and symbols. That's what equalizes the volume through mass, through calculus, all through direct location of your system, all through traction. You change the wall line screens, adaptation with settings, all through dimensional doors. See the doors? So we got door lines of 1, door lines of 2, door lines of 3, 4 lines of setting, 6 lines of flux, 7 lines of setting, 8 rotation set lines of travel. Set calculation screen lines and 45 communication lines of angles and travel communications. This is all inside the simulation grounds at set position. Okay? All through traction. Okay? Look how powerful it is. It's amazing when you see it. That's all set up inside. Signature patterns are very important because it puts lines of human resonance. Now you can calculate and modify how you use anything in equations. You can use your activation line centers, Period activation stream, aperture lines into galactic unit, 3 signals into ground lines of 1. Setting visionary cortex, pick up lines, crop circles, location setting. This is Alpha Bravo, repeat. Sets calculations of 1 cycle, 1 center into mothership over 3. Picks up the signal, picks up the grounds, 3 lines of measure and scale through flux over setting. So the mothership goes cross angles, 4 lines of communication setting out through travel, direct signal location to a system, all through detect. Ground lines of settings, process lines of 3 measures and 3 scale. Okay? Setting core lines of track centers, 0 gravity, 1 center, 1 traction, 1 individual location setting to Saturn of communication. Saturn. Saturn comes in, coordinates over 1, northeast lines, coordinates over lines, 2,000 lines of measure and scale. North line, sectors over 1, 3, set calculation lines. 3 signals, lines of grounds, and high lines position of 3 measure and scale, in position of Pluto, in 2 track location setting of travel. Okay? So, it's very complicated, but it's very easy to understand these things. See, complication is easy, easy is complicated. But how you modify that is all through a clocking center of a screen in flux over line. 3 angles, point lines of graph, and position all levels of its shield. It said travel communications. There's the shield, right? So it's a constant continuous flow of a storyline that processes communication system, how you travel location settings through your electronics, how to set up your alpha, your delta, your theta, or anything through wave screen adaptations, process lines, docking centers, hangar bays, command centers, starships, star communication screens, adaptations, all track correlation setting to planets, coordinates over line, flux over line, question over mark, directing signal location of your system all through travel. So it's a constant continuous flow that constantly changes everything in measure and scale. Okay, because you're never at the same frequency. If I had a 4-line angle, question over mark, equals marks over box into X box. Okay, so X box lines of 1, patterns lines of 4, sequence lines of 3. Tethers lines of 3 over lines of scale over 6. So we set an A track to a B center, equals lines of question, sets position lines of C over D and travel. Okay? So line screen adaptations and data formation lines, cubicle screens, docking 1, hangar bay 6, 8, and 12 in set position. Okay, and then we go through the high centers into the structure of the building. There's the building. Okay, so X2001, 2, because you have 4 lines of point graphs. So they dock their system, okay, through settings. Process lines of 1, process lines of 2, process lines of 3, process lines of 4. Okay, shipping and set lines of distributions. Setting core lines of track centers into alls of Tango, Foxtrot. Signature grounds, general AI, 007. Pick up all lines, shipping containers, directing calculation modify line center lines of service, rotate the system and energy charge. Electrical line grids, discharge, specification, measure, and scale of communication. All through setting. Okay? So everything sets its formula, everything sets its equation, but once you understand how to structure your division locations, you can change your tablets and line screen adaptation all at different angles of its structure of its building and set traction. Okay? Different point lines of graphs, different points of communication setting, all through travel communications. Okay? High signal lines, 45 lines of flush, angle point lines of graph, and interference location system of travel. Directing lines of 0 lines, sets calculation setting direct signals into high positional levels of wormhole interaction. Okay, travel point lines of graph, interset lines, interstellar mode, acceleration lines of 1, mocking 50,000 angles in travel. Center core system of triangulation, flux over lines of pi. Sets core centers of capsules, a time capsule, and time lines of meters, and metric core centers, and meter line communication. Directing high signals inside rotation surface and travel. Ooh-ah. Inside communications. All right, guys. Inside communication of the simulator, of the simulation. Ground lines of service, process lines, triangulations over line. Okay? All through flat surface and travel. Okay? So I'm just showing you how powerful it is when you get your own schematics and highlights, screen adaptations, all lots of just creating position of formulates these equations. Okay? See, it's getting more complicated, but it's getting a lot more fun now because you're getting higher line communications of schematics with your primers, your primates. So everything that you say, okay, gets in the position of what you're saying and how you're saying it. This operates your system, location of your systems, all through tractions. Okay? Setting lines of communication system, all levels at set lines of correlations. So we get a box frame. Okay, so in A lines, we'll go through flux, flux over lines equals lines of triangulation question, set a percentage. So the percentage lines of A over lines to F, sets lines of E, subtracts over 1, plus over angle, signature lines, stern line I, 007. Copy that over now. Okay? So you're constantly creating structures with design lines and screen adaptation of travel. So change the angles of the point lines of graph, all communication to its travel. Okay? So the more you get into the forming the equations of electronics, the more it gets easier through schematics. And then you basically, what you're doing is you're setting up your abundance through manifestation through its image. And when you set up the image, you know exactly what you're sending out because you're constantly in the volume. Into mass, okay? Volume, position lines equals lines of mass, mass equals lines of question, question equals lines of 3, set position slash over 4, set position lines of 12, 24 line ground centers, line communication setting, ozone, like direct correlation setting to travel, into high screen, adaptations all levels of escape, escapes is communication setting, high position all levels, time measure, time scale, time balance, signature lines of panels, high signal location setting, execute platform, direct lines in all line signals into 001, and set travel. Okay? So it's all done from here. Now, if you understand how to use a computer, process lines of a window frame in a track frame. Okay? Into a keyboard frame. Okay? So it's signature lines here, signature lines here. These are just waves. Signature line communication lines of waves. Okay? Same calculations, right? All right, process line. Now let's get in the position of this all flash drive into escape. Hola, ¿cómo estás? Okay, so you got a box frame and you got your number indicators in travel. Starting the box frame locations, right? And then you got your flights, set position of 0 over pi. Okay, traffic communication lines is flash bar, direct signal location setting, in position of Saturn over sequence, flash drive interference. Setting communication lines of grounds, platforms over E factors are 4, setting communication system all through travel and ground lines of setting. Earth tractions in one center, one surface, one position of Earth lines of travel. Setting calculate modify, waving line screens to 3 lines of flux, 3 lines of signals, 3 lines of settings, 3 travel communication, high set track location. And then we get in position lines of high centers into portal, deviation screens, adaptations over line, execute platform, and direct signals of grounds of surface. All through TV line screen adaptations of travel. Okay, volume lines, 45 lines, split lines of an angle. Okay, the angle process communication lines of its fonts, changes direct signals of bold. Directing lines of time measure and time scale. Offline, inline, outline, interceptions over screen. Directing ground lines of setting, process lines of signature location grounds, 3 signature lines, 4 travels and communication. Indicate lines of triangulation lines of 1, process lines of 3 over 4. Setting travel point lines of graph, set lines of communication lines of direct signals, 3 lines of signals over 6. 6 travels in point lines of graph in your position location, your pyramid, in travel communications. Inside setting. The allocate time frame changes, of course, centers of flux over line, 3 centers of signals. Energized. Okay, catapult, the catalyst line communication setting. Of course, centers, line direct signals, light bulb in position lines of 24 lines of scale and communication. Disappeared. You're not ready to see the frequencies. So it's a light bulb that turns on in traction. There's the intelligence. That's the question, right? So the intelligence is coming out of the tube. It's coming out of the wormhole, right? And setting out through the TV lines of measure and scale. Process lines, indication lines of 1 over tractions, 2 over measure, and configuration of face recognition. Okay? There's the face. All right, setting signatures, ground lines of settings into coils of resistors over pi. Process indication line grounds over line signals, setting signature lines of grounds into 3 pyramids and 4 set location of travel, and direct lines of ground lines of surface and human residence. Waving screens, directing line screen adaptation system all through settings. Process lines of indication system to its simulation and ground lines of surface. Okay? Sending communications, high center location to its system, all through travel. Okay? There's the intelligence. And there's the intelligence. And there's the intelligence coming out of the TV through a wormhole. So I just wanted to show you how powerful it is, how it comes in all different angles in setting the travel. Voice and line patterns, 3 signatures, 4 lines of grounds, indicate setting position lines of 4-dimensional door lines, scales its communications to heading lines of travel. Setting point lines of graph, inner force line direct signals in walking sequence. Setting ground lines of high centers, process lines of 1, crosses lines of 2, time measure, time scale, in window frames and travel. Okay? I know it's complicated stuff, but it's a lot of fun when you just have fun and indication. Right? How to bring out the facial recognition system through its intelligence out of its TV or reception. Hoo-ah. Okay? All right, yes, please hold all levels and setting for all Q&A. All right, so I'm just showing you guys how you have to come into your own settings, your own equations. Okay, it's complicated, but it's a lot of fun when you just basically look at it through a graph and how to set up locations in your settings through all levels of your electronics, your energetic line screens, adaptations, all levels. How you talk is how you communicate to yourself and how you communicate to each others. Right? It's knowing exactly the box frame. Okay, box equals frame. Okay, pretty simple, right? Box equals frame / question. Right? So the question mark is basically the box lines of frame itself. The question of the setting of the quantum equals the equations it's going north, and it's going east and south and measure and scale. Okay? So it's setting lines of formation lines of grounds. It formulates the system locations into all levels as its foundation. Foundation lines of question in positions of A track and C lines of C. And then we got AAA, that's AAA. Box frames and battery relines in position lines of 2 lines. Setting course centers of Duracell. Energizer. 3 signal lines of grounds and pi. Okay, so you can do anything in your mind because it's all through your imagination. It's all make-believe. But that make-believe changes the lines of setting. So it takes out the delusion to the illusion to the imagination. And then when you process these things, you have no more problems with your thoughts. You have no problems with your actions. And you have no more problems with your emotions because they don't exist. How they exist is to codify the travels in settings of 3 graph communications. How they connect to the atmospheres is 3 grounds that communicate lines of D factors over screen. How they communicate to high lines, back force lines of E factors in 4 lines of signals and ground lines of service, location of structure of its building in rotation, surface, and travel. Okay? Structure of the building. Structure of the building. And structure of the building. Okay? And all this is done through thoughts, actions, and emotions. Okay? That's all you're doing. You're taking the thought, action, emotions, and you're adding in equal lines equations to your timelines and positional levels. You're breaking timelines, you're collapsing timelines, you're sending lines of signals, you're sending lines of graph and part of acceleration setting, all communicates in the system, all through traction. Okay? So that's what I want you guys to truly understand, how to use that through its equations, through its formulas. Right? Getting in that position locations. Basically, it helps you to understand how to see that. Okay, how you want to see everything in a structure of a design, right? Getting lines of course centers. Let's get instruction lines of communication to a tree. Let's start with the tree line in set position. Right, this is a tree, right? So the tree has an A track, right, which is a firmament over a core, 2 lines of triangulation. Then you have the galaxy shift lines of 1 center, set calculation lines of trifactors, trigonometry lines, the tree screens, directing lines of 4 flux over measure and scale communication. Okay, very powerful stuff through configuration of face recognition, right? So I'm just showing you guys exactly how to set this up through forming this equation of your satellites and modification setting of travel. Getting yourself prepared, know exactly how to basically put your position, location, measure, and scale. So everything you come into positions of is out of memory, out of sync, out of mind. Become an outline signal. Okay, seen from inside, outside, outside, in. Processing lines outside, inside the line, rotation, clocking lines of screen. Directing lines of set, position of symbolism, cross lines of settings, operation server case and setting, and clock lines can be case lines of 0. So it helps you to guide you in information lines of settings. This opens all signals, opens all panels to a set positional case that travel. And track to its communication system, all through tractions. So you have to really understand how to modify this through your letters, numbers, shapes, and symbols, and create it through a formula, through the equations, and take out your thoughts, action, emotions that don't exist. They only exist how you codify things, location, your system, through its equations. All right, see you in 5.